Okay, good to see you all. So this video is a little different. This will not have specific content in it in the form of a lecture. Instead, I want to talk a little bit about the DBQ. Now, we've done a DBQ template where you looked at a DBQ on the American Revolution and you filled out the boxes. So most of the skills you're pretty aware with. We are going to do another practice one this week on the era of good feelings. And so I wanted to go over how you actually will write one, because next week you are going to write an actual one. And so I want to go over all those points and make sure that you have a successful process when you do that. So let's take a look at the actual rubric. I think that would probably do us some good. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so this is the rubric for a DBQ, AP US History. It should be pretty much in line with what you experienced last year for AP World. It's been tweaked and modified. They revamped the APUSH test probably 5-6 years ago. And after they did that, almost every year they were changing how exactly the points are awarded. But really the same skill sets being used every time. Now, most of these points, 5 of the 7, we have gone over before. It's really just the thesis point at the top, and then the complex understanding point at the bottom, sort of the two buns of our sandwich that we hadn't really talked about explicitly, and we worked on the meat, the insides of the sandwich, the body paragraphs, the outside evidence, the bias, all that good stuff. So let's talk about it in its totality. Now, history is not a hard science. I think I've mentioned that to you before. You probably well know in your chemistry classes, your biology classes, one of the tenets of science is that it has to be replicable, meaning that, we produce these results in a lab, you can do it too, and here's our published findings. You can't do that with history. You can't recreate the past. It just doesn't work. We study it, we try to make sense of it, we show documents, but you get into these wonderful arguments. That's the great thing about history, is no one is really right unless they're just doing the whole process wrong and they're just, not really arguing very well. There's no final conclusion one can come to as long as there's more evidence. So your thesis really is just short for hypothesis. It's just we don't use that term because this is not an actual science. A thesis is a theory about the way you think history actually works. And it has to be bold. You have to actually say something. Now, essentially your essay's prompt is the era of good feelings. Was it appropriately named? Was it actually an era of good feelings? Or was it inappropriately named because it was a very tense period in American history? Remember, the main reason we call it the era of good feelings is during the presidency of Monroe, 1817 to 1825, there was only one political party. After the War of 1812, the Federalist Party completely collapsed, imploded, and we do not see a Whig party again until the 1830s. So for 20 years, pretty much, after the War of 1812, we just don't have another opposition party. So that might lead one to believe everything was wonderful, but there's some evidence on the other side that it wasn't great. There is evidence that it was good, though, too. So your thesis here needs to say something. Either it was an era of good feelings and here's why, or it was not and here's why not. Now, it's a fine line to walk in a thesis. You need to say something. Okay, it says responds to the prompt with a historically defensible thesis or claim that establishes a line of reasoning. You need to say, yes, it was, or no, it wasn't, but you can't just leave it at that. You need to say a little more. However, you don't want to go into too much detail because that's what the body paragraph's for. You don't need to be citing documents in your thesis. You should not be doing that. What you should do instead is say something like this. During the era of good feelings, it was appropriately named because the Federalist Party collapsed and really merged with the Republican Party. That would be a good line of reasoning, right? You just sort of give the reader a taste of what you will talk about, right? And this minimizes political conflicts on the national stage. Or it was not an era of good feelings because there were some terrible things that happened. There was an economic panic in 1819 that very much angered many people. And there was also a very tense moment over Missouri with the Missouri Compromise and these conflicts over slavery. So how good could it be? Yes, we eventually compromised, but this sort of underbelly of the division between the free North and the slave South was revealed, and it was a very tense moment. We very nearly had a civil war. Those would be examples of an acceptable thesis. Okay, so this is your intro paragraph. You write your thesis, and with it in the intro, you need to have your contextualization part B. Okay? What this is it says describes a broader historical context relevant to the prompt. This is the part where I think I mentioned to you before, where you say last time on a push, right? Like, how did we get here to 1817? What happened before that's related to this? And what would give the reader of this essay context, right? Just like they do in your favorite TV series, so that, you know, I really want to jump into Game of Thrones in season 7, but I haven't watched 1 through 6. Can I just start here? They give you a little like 1-minute snippet montage of what happened before. Likewise here, you would need to say, well, in the 1790s, it was an incredibly divisive period. Our first president, Washington, didn't like political parties, discouraged against it. Madison wrote against factions in the Federalist Papers. Many founding fathers didn't like it. But tensions over the Alien and Sedition Act and the Quasi-War forced Adams and Jefferson to kind of pull the country into 2 different parties. We get the Federalists on one hand and the Republicans on the other, and they disagree on these issues of a national bank, internal improvements, and a tariff. Then these parties collapsed in 1815 when the Federalist Party refused to support the War of 1812. Okay, that's an example. It's probably even too detailed, but you know, I'm an overachiever. I am the teacher. So that would be an example of your context, your contextualization point. So in your first paragraph, you should have thesis and you should have your context. How did we get to this point? And what am I going to say? What's the point of this essay? Right? Your essay is not just a bunch of words jumping from document to document. You're using the documents to support your thesis, and your thesis is right up front. Here's how I think history worked. The era of good feelings was really good, or it's named that, but it should not be. Okay? Now, when you get actually into the body paragraphs of your essay, you're going to start doing the parts that you're very familiar with. All right? So first, you get 1 point if you use the content of at least 3 documents to address the topic of the prompt, right? So basically, you're going to separate your documents into 2 paragraphs, right? These documents show era of good feelings awesome. These over here show it really wasn't. If you can only use 3 documents to support both sides of the argument, okay, meaning 3 total, right? 1 document to show yes, it was awesome, 2 documents to show no, it wasn't. That's 3 documents total. You get a single point for that. If you do 6, meaning like 3 supporting yes, it was great, and 3 showing not so great in 2 different paragraphs, that's 6. If you use them and you use them correctly. Okay, so this is just the part of your template where you're going through, you're reading the documents and you go, this document shows era good feelings was great, or this shows that it wasn't. Okay. Now, in each body paragraph, you need to have 1 additional piece of outside information, right? So something that's just not mentioned in the documents at all, there's no representation for it. You say, well, this is part of the era of good feelings as well, or here's something that happened at the same time that shows it wasn't an era of good feelings. And you would bring that out. It's almost like you're saying, here's 2 new documents, but they're not actual documents. They're just you remembering stuff. Here's a concrete piece of outside information. The reason why I mention it like it's like a document is it should be some proper noun, not some vague thing, right? I think there was some trouble with the economy sometime around there. I don't know why it happened. The Panic of 1819. It happened because of a speculative bubble in investment in land, and then the bubble popped and land prices collapsed. And there was renewed competition from Europe over shipping industry. Panic of 1819. Okay, that would be outside information. Need 2 of them. Hopefully one in one body paragraph showing support for the thesis one way and then one the other way. Okay. Finally, analysis and reasoning, part D. For at least 3 documents, you explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and/or audience is relevant to the argument. So this is your bias analysis. Sourcing, I think, is what Mr. Mulvihill called it. So you need to look at 3 total documents. So you want to do like 2 and 1 or 1 and 2, right? Separate, make sure it's balanced between the body paragraphs. And you're going to look at the document and say, the author is biased because of whatever reason, right? They're writing this to prove a point, or of course this guy thinks this because he's of this political party or this class or this occupation. I think you well know how to do it, and you need to comment on that if the results are not that surprising, right? Oh, wow, you know, John Calhoun says that slavery is a great system. Well, he was a slave owner and the biggest defender of slavery ever in the history of America. Of course he's going to say that, right? Something like that. So 3 documents total on that, you get 1 point. And then finally, the last one, this is the hardest one to describe how to get. This is the complex understanding. I always encourage students to put this in the last paragraph, paragraph 4, and just to try to do the best that you can. There's a lot of ways to earn this, right? It says demonstrates complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. So lots of ways to earn this. Number 1, explaining nuance of an issue by analyzing multiple variables. Okay, I'm not even really sure what they're talking about there. What variables are they talking about? I don't really know, but I suppose if you're looking at, you know, multiple different things, like what caused the Civil War, was it slavery or states' rights? I suppose those are different variables, and you talk about each one, and that's more complex understanding. Second, explaining both a similarity and a difference, or explaining both continuity and change, or explaining multiple causes, or explaining both cause and effect. That's pretty basic. If you do both of those, right? If the prompt just asks you to do one and you do both, then you're good to go. It's sort of going beyond what the prompt asks you to bring more stuff to the table there. Explaining relevant and insightful connections within and across periods. So if this essay is about the era of good feelings and you go to another time period where similarly America seemed to be getting along better, there was a strong political consensus, no major political strife, that'd be a good time period to bring up as well. Confirming the validity of an argument by corroborating multiple perspectives across themes. So if you have multiple different perspectives on an issue, it's only asking for one, and you bring up all these other multiple ones, and that goes far as well. And finally, qualifying or modifying an argument by considering diverse or alternate views or evidence, okay? So that's taking evidence to the contrary and explaining it away, basically. So this is a very, very hard point to earn. What I tell my students to do, the best way to think about it, because these will, some of these are appropriate sometimes, some of them aren't. It just depends on the prompt. It depends on the documents. What always comes up as an opportunity for this point is what was happening in the rest of the world at the same time that's related, and then what happened in another American period of history that's similar. Okay? So this is not the essay that you guys are writing, but there's multiple essays that I've seen prompts about manifest destiny, right? Westward expansion across the continent. And it's just like talking about the 1840s, the Mexican War, right? And you could say, well, this isn't in the prompt, but westward expansion can go back all the way to the colonial period and this drive to plant more tobacco. Or the Revolution, how Americans wanted the land west of the Appalachians. Or the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, again, westward expansion. So this idea was always there, not just in the 1840s. Or you could go 1898, the US reaches the Pacific Ocean and goes beyond and conquers the Philippines. These are all examples of going beyond the time period to say this same theme of westward expansion exists in other time periods as well. And here's the evidence for it, right? Or you could go to another country, right? If you're talking about the US conquest of the Philippines and you said that was 1898 and it happened at the same time that the British were in India and all over Africa and Asia, and the French were in Africa and Indochina, et cetera, right? Is that this was part of a colonial process that other superpowers were doing at the same time, not necessarily defending it, but just giving it that proper context, but not context what happened before, but what happened outside of America. Okay, so those are various ways of earning complex understanding. It is very hard. I hate to break this to you guys, but I'm willing to bet no one will get a 7 out of 7 on the actual DBQ. You won't know the topic in advance. You're writing under stress and duress. It's very hard to do. And that's just the hardest point to earn. So I would say, if you're running out of time, just don't even write a conclusion. You've got your thesis in the first body paragraph. You don't get extra points for repeating it. So leave it out if you're short on time, because it is a darn hard point to earn. Now, if you have the time, take a crack at it. If you don't get it, you don't get it. Okay. So real quick, I just want to show you an actual template of an essay that I drew up for this era of good feelings prompt. Was it really an era of good feelings? Was it not? Here's how you would kind of sketch it out, sort of a thumbnail sketch of it. And I'll post all this stuff on Canvas if you want to take a look at it, okay? Now, again, this is not the actual DBQ where you're going to write. You're going to write one on Andrew Jackson next week. This is the practice one where you fill out the boxes on the template, but I want to show you examples so you know how to earn all 7 points on a DBQ. Was the era of good feelings really great or was it not? Okay. If you were to write an essay, your first paragraph should have 2 points, thesis and context. Thesis: in some ways, the era of good feelings was appropriately named because, you have to fill in the gaps, but in other ways, it was inappropriately named because of ... Answer the question as completely and succinctly as you can. Don't cite or quote the documents. Okay, so if you write a good thesis where you say, well, in some ways it was because of these reasons, and in some ways it wasn't because of those reasons. That may seem wishy-washy, and it kind of is, but you're going to have documents that show both sides of it, and you need to do that. Now, it's totally okay to ultimately land on one of those sides, and you probably should, but that's what you're kind of getting at, right? You're going to have documents going in either orientation, and you want to say, well, in these ways, right? When we talk about political party, sure, it was an era of good feelings, but when you talk about the economic collapse and the division over slavery, it wasn't. Okay? That says something, but it's not so vague. A bad thesis would be, some call this an era of good feelings. In some ways it was, in some ways it wasn't. Okay, what's your evidence going to show? Give us a taste of what the actual body paragraph will be. Okay? Contextualization. Give a few sentences of background on the topic of the overall DBQ. Think of it like the 1-minute intro to your favorite show, last time on A Push, and then give a quick summary of the past episodes to get you up to speed. Talk about the division that existed before, how we had 2 parties, and it was a very nasty process. 1790s is about the most divisive period in our history. The worst of all is the 1850s going into the Civil War. 1790s is pretty bad. I hate to break it to you. Y'all are living through another one that is pretty darn bad. Ever since 1992, pretty much, political historians would say American politics has been way screwed up. It's been a very nasty affair for the last 30 years, basically. But you need to give that background info so when we get to the era of good feelings, it has meaning, right? Who cares we only had one political party, right? How many does this country have anyway? You got to tell the reader how many we normally have throughout our history, which is 2 almost always. In this brief time period, we only had 1. So it had the appearance of being an era of good feelings. Paragraph 2, okay, you're going to need to cover one side of it, the other paragraph's the opposite side. So we'll say this is the paragraph that supports era of good feelings appropriately named. Use at least 3 documents that you go through in the DBQ to illustrate that it was appropriately named. Take direct evidence from the documents to support the part of the thesis that the era of good feelings was appropriately named. Paraphrase the evidence, put it into your own words. Okay, don't quote the documents, never quote the documents. It does nothing. They don't interpret themselves. You must interpret it. Okay, so don't quote, summarize, paraphrase. Document 2 is really all about this, and it supports era of good feelings, right? For instance. Quoting the documents is unnecessary, won't help you, and is a waste of time. Okay, so use those 3 documents correctly, you get a point. Use one piece of outside evidence not in the documents to support the part of the thesis that the era of good feelings was appropriately named. So you got your 3 documents actually there, and then you're bringing outside evidence and saying, this is outside evidence that shows the same thing. Try to be as specific as you can. Use proper nouns if you can. Okay? Use a proper noun, not some vague description. Be specific about why it's relevant to support your thesis. You need to provide one piece of outside evidence overall. If not provided here, you may do it in the next paragraph. I always say 2 because technically the rubric does say outside evidence singular. Evidence is a weird word though. It's plural by its nature. It's kind of like equipment. It's just, it could be singular, it could be plural, but they just say evidence. So they just say, cites an example of outside evidence. So that appears to be one document. I always say to do 2 because you're doing 2 opposite sides. That just makes more sense. Try if you can to do 2. Okay. All right. For purposes of my grading, I always make sure students have 2. For purposes of the AP test, I think 1 will do, but try your very best to do 2. All right. Let's see. For a total of 3 documents overall, explain how or why a document's bias is relevant. 1 point. Okay, so you need to remember 3 overall, so either bring in 1 or 2 to do here, and you talk about point of view, author, purpose, audience, and explain how the document's bias must be called into question. Now, real quick, I know last year Mulvihill trained you where you said, well, we had 1 body paragraph showing one side of the argument, 1 showing the other side, and then we did our bias in a 3rd body paragraph. That is totally fine. Doesn't matter. I set it up this way, but so many of you have been trained to have like a separate paragraph to do bias. Doesn't matter to me. That's up to you. If you want to do a 5-paragraph essay where you have, your intro with your context, paragraph 1 showing, hey, it was an era of good feelings, paragraph 3 saying it's not an era of good feelings, your bias paragraph, and then your complex understanding, totally fine. Just make sure it's there somewhere, either in this, 4-paragraph formula or in a 5, but however you want to do it. You got to bring in 2 and 1 or 1 and 2, okay? Or all 3 in its own separate body paragraph. So the point of view, author, purpose showing that this person is biased in some capacity. Paragraph 3, era of good feelings was inappropriately named. It's not an era of good feelings. So you have 3 documents that show the opposite. Here's tensions during the era. Here's problems. Here's strife. Take direct evidence from the documents to support that part of the thesis that it was inappropriately named. Paraphrase the evidence, put it in your own words. Quoting the documents is unnecessary, won't help you, and is a waste of time. Use outside evidence, bring in another piece of outside evidence, just kind of couple together with the evidence that's actually there and say, this also shows that it wasn't all wonderful. Use a proper noun, not some vague description. Be specific about why it's relevant to support your thesis. You need to provide 1 piece of outside evidence overall. If not provided here, you may do it in the previous paragraph. And then you got your other documents for bias, right? If you did 1 above, you do 2 here, or if you did 2 above, you do 1 here, or you do it in its own paragraph. That's up to you. And you have 3 documents overall explaining how the author or the purpose or the point of view is biased in some way. Okay, in your conclusion, you mention your complex understanding. What I would do is try to do some studying on another country that went through a period where it was very amicable and there was sort of an understanding in politics and it was sort of normal, or go to another period in American history where there was sort of a general consensus on most things, political wise. It's a very hard point to earn, but think about it before you go in. Okay, that's basically it. I just wanted to show you this because we have practiced most of these skills, right? We did the bias, the outside evidence, bias, outside evidence. We did using the documents to support the thesis. That's basically 4 of your 7 points. We just didn't do, and we talked a little bit about context, but not so much. So we didn't talk about thesis, context, and we didn't do complex understanding. And I wanted to talk about those points here and demonstrate to you how you can set up your essay when you eventually write the one on Andrew Jackson. Remember, you're not going to technically write one on the era of good feelings. I'm just showing you, if we were going to do this one, here's how it would look actually, written up, like, sketched out, templated out with the paragraphs and everything. Okay. All right, that's basically it. I just wanted to go over that. You guys could watch this at your leisure, and you will be ready to go next time that we actually have to write one. Next time we write one, you'll have the rubric handy. You'll have a DBQ you technically haven't seen before, but you should do fine on it because I'll tell you the topic in advance and you can do a lot of research. So the outside evidence should be pretty apparent and it'll be easier to interpret the docs and easier to write your thesis and everything, okay? All right, good to see you all. Take care, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.